of all, I would like to thank this event for having us and giving us the opportunity of presenting our research. I am Bruna, and I'm going to present a little bit about our study, which is called Meaning Construction on ELF, English as a Lingua Franca, in a teacher education course in Brazil. We are from the State University of Maringá, Brazil. So for us to start, I would like to explain the objectives of our study. So the purpose of this study is to present how ELF was included in a teacher education course in the language arts undergraduate program of a university in Brazil, a public university. And then inside this discipline, inside this course, the idea was to analyze how the Preservice teachers, the students in this course, constructed meanings about ELF, yes, during the classes. So this is the purpose of our study. So our study is based on scholars such as Calvo, Jenkins, Siqueira, Duboc, Jimenez, Elcadre, Calvo, among others, who study ELF and also ELF and teacher education, right? So our study was an ethnographic type, a case study, since we collected this data in a specific context, yes. And the data I'm bringing today was generated through class recordings and analysis of the activities that were carried out by the undergraduate students in remote classes, because this course was taught in 2021 during the pandemic. So the classes, they were remote back then. So we base our study on the idea that ELF, the concept of ELF we consider here is English being used as a lingua franca, which is the common language of choice among speakers who come from different lingua cultural backgrounds, as Jenkins, 2009, pointed out. Also, English, when it is spoken as a contact language by speakers from varying lingua cultural backgrounds, where both the community of speakers and the location can be changing and are often not associated with a specific nation, which was written by Kogu, 2012. So this is the concept of English as a lingua franca that we considered in our study. When we think of ELF and teacher education, we consider studies from scholars such as Santos, Siqueira, and Sifakis. They all point out the importance of bringing discussions about ELF, about this perspective, to teacher education programs, to teacher education contexts, because they consider that even though it's a laborious initiative, the results can contribute to teachers becoming more aware about the meaning of what it means to teach English today. Yeah, so they can be more prepared to deal with the challenges that they might have, and to make the necessary decisions that they will probably have to make in their teaching context. Right? So Sifakis also considers that it is important that the teachers become aware of their attitudes towards ELF and can reflect on aspects such as the limitations of ELF, creativity in ELF interactions, the issue of language ownership, and the roles of native and non-native speakers in this context of interaction. So as I mentioned before, the context of this study is a language arts undergraduate program in a Brazilian public university in Paraná. And the course itself focuses on teacher education, linguistics, literature, and English. Yes. And the courses are taught in Portuguese and or in English. So in the case of the specific classes that we analyzed here, the classes were both in English and Portuguese. Yeah, so the classes we analyzed here were the ones in which ELF was discussed. So this is these classes were the ones we analyzed here. Classes from the English teacher education course in which ELF was the topic. So the specific course we analyzed here is in the third year of this undergraduate program. And we analyzed the lessons that happened in 2020 in which ELF was introduced to the students and the topic was discussed. Yeah, so 11 lessons focused on ELF. So we analyzed these lessons specifically. We recorded them and then transcribed the lessons and analyzed the number of students in class, around 25 students, which can change according to the classes, right? And then as it was a remote course, Google Meet and Google Classroom were the platforms used by the professor for synchronous and asynchronous interactions. The materials we selected, we made this table to organize and to show the materials used by the professor during this course. Yeah, so there were a number of technological tools as well, since the class was in a remote context, right? But the professor also used a lot of academic texts, such as O Lugar do Inglês no Mundo Globalizado, by Rajagopal Palam, English as a Lingua Franca, an interview with Jennifer Jenkins, Renomeando Inglês e Formando Professores, by Jimenez, Teaching Beyond Stereotypes with Intercultural Communicative Competence by Pedersen, Tips for Teaching Culture in a Globalized World by Oliveira, and the technological tools were slides, the Mentimeter, the Jamboard, Google Jamboard, Padlet, and a number of tools which allowed the classes to be more dynamic in a remote context. The professor also used a number of videos which addressed the issue of ELF, such as Global English, a video with David Crystal, Should English be Taught as a Global Language? Also a video by David Crystal, and an interview with professors Siqueira and Figueiredo from Brazil. And another videos were used in the classes as context to show speakers from different backgrounds speaking in English, yes, such as a video with Pope Francis, an interview with Anitta, the singer from Brazil. So these are some of the materials used. So moving on, we analyzed how the Preservice teachers constructed meanings on ELF. Yeah, so we observed that we considered their previous knowledge about the topic, right? And we observed that they construct these meanings based on the explanations that the professor gave, on the comments she made, and also the materials that were used in the classes. Yes. The questions and reflections made by the professor and her feedback to the students were really important, as we're going to see. And they were also able to relate the topic that we were discussing, ELF, to the English classroom and to their own experience as English teachers. Okay, so when it comes to the previous knowledge about the topic, we observed that just a few students had this previous contact with ELF, a few students mentioned that they had already heard of it or been in a lecture about ELF or heard of it in another class, in another course. Yes. And also we observed that the other initiatives that they mentioned, they were carried out by the same professor that was teaching the course that we analyzed. Yeah, so it shows that we don't really have a lot of initiatives in this context that address ELF, right? Because they were carried out by the same professor. And about the how the students base their construction of meaning on the explanations, comments, and materials, we observed that they constructed a dialogue. Yes, so students during the classes they used to agree with each other, they used to make comments, to bring back a classmate's idea or comment and build on it, right? So, for example, have here a dialogue in which student one says, "Yeah, I was going to say that too, student two." And then student two answers, "Yeah, I will say something." And then student one can complement. So we see that there is this collaborative atmosphere. Yeah, they can complement each other and so on. And also another example, we have a conversation between student 7 and student 8. Student 7 says, "Well, that's what I tell my students. Use the language to your advantage and in the best way we can." And then the other student answers, "Yes, it's very nice what student 7 said because there are many students who link fluency with native accent, right?" So they were able to relate their comments to their classmates' comments and build a meaning and construct meaning according to in their dialogues, right? In their conversations by interacting with each other. The students they also articulate their points with the professor's explanation. So a lot of times they comment on what the professor said and they say, "Yes, I agree with you because as the professor said, I see this in my classroom as well," or something. And they are also able to relate um, their thoughts on ELF to the material. So they bring back, sometimes they bring back a specific text from a specific author. So I read the text the other day, the text that teacher brought, the Jenkins interview, and then I remembered that I agree with this idea. You know, so they bring it shows to us, it showed to us that they construct meaning according to the material. So the materials were meaningful to them, they could relate to their reality, and it made sense, right? It made sense. Yeah, so they mentioned the authors they read to support their point of view. This is what I meant before. And then the questions and reflections made by the professor and her feedback to the students, right? So it was something that we observed that happened in every class. The professor always made some comments encouraging the students and thanking them for their participation. And when we consider that this context was a remote context, this is really important, especially because the students sometimes they don't feel comfortable speaking in online classes. It can be some kind of I don't know, a new experience to them. And also the context of the pandemic was really challenging for everyone. So it was really important that the professor was able to encourage the students to participate. Yes, and she was always giving them feedback and commenting on their speeches in class and so on. So we have here a few examples. The questions, the feedback. She was always thought provoking them all the time. Yeah, so these questions that we mentioned here is how the professor was always stimulating the students to reflect on what was presented to them and not only watch and sit there, watch the class, and so on. So she made comments like, yeah, thank you for bringing this aspect. Um, I think both of you have good considerations. Would you like to add anything else to these comments? So she was always encouraging them to participate. They also relate the topic that they are studying to the English classroom because even though they are pre-service teachers, a lot of them have been in class or a lot of them are teaching, yes, and then they are able to relate this experience that they have to the content that they're seeing. So they make comments like, of course, these videos are very good for the students' reality and for them to feel comfortable in using the language as well for communication, for sure. So student 7 is one of the students that always mentions his students in class and how he used or how he's going to use videos that the professor brought to class and how his students enjoy watching these videos and discussing about how wealth isn't only we don't have to sound American, we don't have to sound British, yes. And also student 8 made a comment like, Professor, I think possibly bringing the students the notion that English is not only American or British. So when they were questioned about how are you going to include these discussions in your classroom, how can you bring this perspective, this elf perspective, to your classroom? So they mentioned the ideas they have according to the context they are working on, and it was really interesting to see how they are able to do this. So, in conclusion, some concluding remarks we point out here is that meaning construction based on the colleagues and professors' mediation as well as on the ELF literature happens. Yeah, so the materials that the professor brought to class, they are really important, but also this dialogue between students, between the professor and the students is really important so they can construct meaning on ELF, right? The pre-service teachers, they could articulate the discussions to their practice as teachers, and they could bring examples of how it can or how it impacted their practice for the discussions. And also the questioning and the reflections provoked by the professor were also important. So we see that the professor had this role of encouraging the students, of motivating them to speak their mind, to share their experiences along the classes. The different materials, as I mentioned, they were really important because, especially if we consider the remote context, right? So the different tools that the professor used, um, not only the texts or videos, but the tools like the Mentimeter, which is a tool that allows the students to participate in a different way, not only speaking, but they could type things, they could post things in Padlet, they could post a comment on Google Classroom. So there were other ways in which students could share their experience in class, right? There weren't many criticisms towards ELF. I believe that it is related to the fact that it was the first, for most of them, it was the first time they were getting in touch with this perspective, right? So we conclude that it's necessary to continue this discussion about this perspective, not only in disciplines that focus on teacher education, but in other contexts within the university, right? So workshops and other kinds of courses. it's important for us to continue creating opportunities for the students to get in touch with this health perspective, which is so meaningful for them nowadays. As I mentioned before, the importance of bringing these discussions to teacher education, right? So these are our references for this presentation. Thank you so much for the opportunity of sharing a little bit of our study. And if you have any questions, you can send us a message, you can send us an email. We'll be pleased to answer you. Thank you so much.